Let's take a closer look at some detailed pictures of the new Red Bull RB19. In my first video we took a closer look from far away and we haven't been too far off. As expected, Red Bull kept their successful concept and only refined it. The nose got slightly wider and boxier, the side pods look very similar but slightly wider, and the airbox is smaller. So let's start at the front. The front wing looks more backed off and they save some paint at the nose. Also here they back off the front wing at the tips to generate outwash to keep the front rear wake outboard. Red Bull kept the far forward sitting side pod inlets and has, again, the largest undercut of the grid. Newey's philosophy was always to get as much clean air as possible to the back, and we see it in this concept as well. The backed off front wing disturbs the flow less, and the large undercut makes sure that air gets to the back as gently as possible. We can see a blister for the lower side impact tube, and Red Bull uses large outer strakes as barge boards to keep the lower wake outboard. The middle wake is pushed outboard by the strong clean flow from the undercut, and it looks like Red Bull increased the bluff sidewall a bit to keep the upper wake outboard for longer. Interesting is that Red Bull made the undercut in the middle of the side pod deeper, and that reminds me of a problem the Force India VJM11 had. The side pod undercut was so small and deep, air velocity was pretty high and boundary layers clashed, which weakened the flow inside this area. The result was that the flow was too weak and too fast to follow the Coke bottle shape, and the flow separated. The result was a massive loss of downforce in fast corners and an unpredictable behavior for the driver. To fix that, Force India installed a large vortex generator exactly in this spot, which mixed the weak flow with high energy, and the flow could follow the side pod shape again. So lessons learned back in the day was to avoid tight undercuts in this sensitive area. Now Red Bull does exactly that, and we can see that they are concerned about this as well. They use 2 keel probes before that area to check the flow before, and they use 6 keel probes after the area to check if the flow is doing what they saw in CFD. Interesting is, in this view, how high the rear brake ducts are sitting to make space for clean flow below to reach the beam wing. Additionally, Red Bull flow vised this area. The flow looks very clean and attached, but there is an interesting upwashing area. It looks like this is caused by the raised floor section and the air flows to the low pressure area. The slightly more side pod volume, engine improvements and also experiences of last year with these new cars resulted in a slimmer airbox, which improves the energy delivery to the rear wing. And the rear wing is interesting as well, because it got flow vised too. We are used to see very clean flow on Red Bull cars, but this time it looks a bit different. We can see that the flow vis wasn't completely dry on the main element, but everything else was dry already. And even if the flap was still not dry, flow vis can only stay there like this if there is no attached flow. The flow on the main element looks fine, but the problem is the flap. We see the highest flow velocity right after the slot gap, and this is usually the area where the flow vis paint gets blown away. Also, because of the high velocity, the transition between laminar and turbulent boundary layer happens here. What we see on the RB19 now looks like a separation bubble across the span with a reattachment and clean flow to the trailing edge. So is this concerning? It shows that the wing is heavily stressed and it's not ideal. It would become a big problem if the flow wouldn't reattach. But that's not all. Also, the beam wing flow looks unusually messy for Red Bull, and the lower element is completely separated. And this flow looks dry. Interesting is also that Red Bull kept their large suspension outlet, which points directly at the beam wing. So what we suggested on the Ferrari, an outlet pointing at the beam wing, is what we can see on the Red Bull, and could already see last year. That allows you to direct high energy flow directly to the back instead of guiding it around the side pod and losing energy. The question is just, where's the inlet? The opening for the push rod sits a lot higher and helps to release hot air, so the cooling exit can be a bit smaller and more energy reaches the back. Interesting to see is also how they installed the pressure tubes. They just taped it on the car, which would have been hidden away a bit nicer in recent years. But that would have been more expensive as well. So all in all, the Red Bull RB19 is pretty much what we expected. A refinement of last year's successful concept. It's a good sign that they check their undercut area in detail on the first day of the test to avoid problems other teams had in the past. Because they stayed with their basic concept, they can shift their resources to other areas to gain performance. So how do you like the new RB19? Let me know in the comments below and check out my other F1 videos for more.